Question 76 of the Summa Theologia Prima Pars is about the union of body and soul. Okay, this is the second question on the Treatise of Man. And as I said yesterday, about 27 questions on human nature. And you're going to learn a whole lot about yourself. And it really gets interesting. This is an interesting 8 articles on the union of body and soul, because in the last question we talked about the essence of the soul, what a soul is. It's not the same as an angel. It's different, and it's always united to a body, and it's different in a human being and an animal. So now, how exactly do the soul and the body unite, and how does that actually happen? And that's what is on Thomas's mind as he goes through these 8 articles. Some of these are pretty complicated, but they're interesting nonetheless. Article 1 says whether the intellectual principle is united to the body as its form. Okay, so how many times do I have to say that form and matter are really important? Okay, they're going to play a big part of the sacraments, and it plays a big part in everything, because every visible being, everything has form and matter, including you and I, and that's what St. Thomas Aquinas is talking about here. So he says that we must assert that the intellect, which is the principle of intellectual operation, is the form of the human body. Okay, so the form is kind of what defines it, what gives it what it is. Okay, so the frogness is the essence of a frog, but that's the form, and it's what you have the matter. But if we're trying to figure out, like, what is that thing, we abstract the form from it and what it is as a universal, right? So form is very important, and it's very important if we're going to understand human nature to know what's the form of a human being. And now we found out that it's the intellectual soul is what it is. Okay. For that whereby primarily anything acts is a form of the thing to which the act is to be attributed. A thing acts by that whereby it is in act. Now it is clear that the first thing by which the body lives is the soul, and as life appears through various operations in different degrees of living things, that whereby we primarily perform each of these vital actions is the soul. For the soul is the primary principle of our nourishment, sensation, and local movement, and likewise our understanding. I often say when I teach high school students, I said, if my soul departed from my body right now, I'd be dead. And all you would have left is a corpse. So everything that is different from a corpse and a living human being, that's because of the soul. Okay, so it's pretty much everything other than a lifeless lump of flesh, right? Therefore, this principle by which we primarily understand whether it be called the intellect or the intellectual soul is the form of the body. By the way, this article is probably the longest article that we've had in the entire Summa so far. This one's really long. We're not going to cover all of it. So when we say that Socrates or Plato understands, it's clear that this is not attributed to him accidentally, since it is ascribed to him as man, which is predicated of him essentially. We must therefore say either that Socrates understands by virtue of his whole self, as Plato maintained, holding that man is an intellectual soul, or that intelligence is a part of Socrates. Okay, so is our whole body our intelligence, our form, or is it a part of us? Is it something that is a faculty? And this, of course, is what Thomas is going to say. But one cannot sense without a body, therefore the body must be some part of man. It follows thereby that the intellect by which Socrates understands is a part of Socrates, so that in some way it is united to the body of Socrates. Now remember, when we talked about divine nature, the intellect wasn't a part of God, it was God. God is his intellect. God is his will. God is his suppositum, okay? God is love. It's all the same with God. All right, so some, however, try to maintain that the intellect is united to the body as a motor. Now, this is more Plato, right? that the body is just being moved along by the soul, all right? And hence that the intellect and the body form one thing so that the act of the intellect could be attributed to the whole. This is, however, absurd for many reasons, okay? So he's not going to say that that is the case. All right, let me read a couple more paragraphs from this article. I told you this one's long, okay? The other ones aren't this long. There remains, therefore, no other explanation than that given by Aristotle, namely that this particular man understands because the intellectual principle is his form. Thus, from the very operation of the intellect, it is made clear that the intellectual principle is united to man as its form. The same can be clearly shown from the nature of the human species, for the nature of each thing is shown by its operation. Now, the proper operation of man as man is to understand, because he thereby surpasses all other animals. Whence Aristotle concludes that the ultimate happiness of man must consist in this operation as properly belonging to him. Okay, to have an intellect, that is our highest function. That's what separates us from all the other creatures in the world. Man must therefore derive his species from that which is the principle of this operation, but the species of anything is derived from its form. It follows therefore that the intellectual principle is the form of man. But we must observe that the nobler a form is, the more it rises above corporeal matter, the less it is merged in matter, and the more it excels matter by its power and operation. God is entirely incorporeal, right? The angels are incorporeal, but they're still creatures. Something like a rock has no spiritual element to it, so it's the lowest. So as you move up the hierarchy of being, it becomes less physical. All right, so finally, as the vegetative soul excels the form of the metal and the sensitive soul excels the vegetative soul, now the human soul is the highest and noblest of forms. Wherefore it excels corporeal matter in its power by the fact that it has an operation and a power in which corporeal matter has no share whatever. The power is called the intellect. Okay, so that was all one article, and I know they're not all going to be this long, right? They're going to be a lot shorter. Whether the intellectual principle is multiplied according to the number of bodies. I find this fascinating, right? Okay, is there just one intellectual principle that everybody shares, that, everybody has the same intellectual principle? Thomas is going to say no. But it's challenging because you and I are different by our bodies, but we share an intellectual soul. But how is our intellectual soul different, right? If it has so much to do with our personality and so many different things, how is that different? That's what Thomas is getting at here. It's absolutely impossible for one intellect to belong to all men. This is clear if, as Plato maintained, man is the intellect itself. For it would follow that Socrates and Plato are one man, and that they are not distinct from each other except by something outside the essence of each. The distinction between Socrates and Plato would be no other than that one man has a tunic and another with a cloak, which is quite absurd. Okay, so yeah, the only difference between Socrates and Plato is not the clothes that they're wearing, right? It is likewise clear that it is impossible if, according to the opinion of Aristotle, it is supposed that the intellect is a part or a power of the soul, which is the form of man. For it is impossible for many distinct individuals to have one form, as it is impossible for them to have one existence, for the form of the principle of existence. For the form is the principle of existence. So again, what's he getting at here? He's trying to figure out, how are we different other than our bodies? If we don't have share one intellect, how are our souls different? It is clear that no matter how the intellect is united or coupled to this or that man, the intellect has the precedence of all the other things which appertain to man, for the sensitive powers obey the intellect and are at its service. Therefore, if we suppose two men to have several intellects and one sense, for instance, if two men had one eye, there would be several seers, but one sight. So he's giving these examples here. It's very interesting. But if there is one intellect, no matter how diverse may be all those things of which the intellect makes use of its instruments, In no way is it possible to say that Socrates and Plato are otherwise than one understanding man. All right. I think that's it for this article. There is some more. Let's see. It's interesting here. I will just read this one sentence. He says, however, it would be possible to distinguish my intellectual action from yours by the distinction of the phantasms. What's interesting about that sentence is that St. Thomas Aquinas very rarely uses first-person pronouns. My intellectual action. He's comparing his intellect to ours, which is quite frankly not a comparison that I am really that interested in finding out how less intelligent I am than St. Thomas Aquinas. All right, whether besides the intellectual soul, there are in man other souls essentially different from one another. All right, there's a lot of different kinds of souls. Do we have multiple souls? Do we have one soul? How does that all work? Plato held that there were several souls in one body, distinct even as to organs, to which souls he referred the different vital actions, saying that the nutritive power is in the liver, the concupiscible in the heart, and the power of knowledge is in the brain, which opinion is rejected by Aristotle with regard to those parts of the soul which use corporeal organs. For this reason, that in those animals which continue to live, when they have been divided in each part, are observed the operations of the soul as sense and appetite. Okay, so when certain animals are separated, you continue to see the operation in both sides, right? If we suppose, however, that the soul is united to the body as its form, it is quite impossible for several essentially different souls to be in one body. This can be made clear by three different reasons. So what he's saying here is there's one soul, but the one soul has many different parts. Let me read the most important part here. He says, we must therefore conclude that in man the sensitive soul, the intellectual soul, and the nutritive soul are numerically one soul. This can be easily explained if we consider the difference of species and forms. For we observe that the species and forms of things differ from one another as the perfect and the imperfect. As in the order of things, the animate are more perfect than the inanimate, the animals more perfect than the plants, and the man more perfect than brute animals, and in each of these genera there are various degrees. Thus the intellectual soul contains virtually whatever belongs to the sensitive soul of brute animals and the nutritive soul of plants. You know, when you see a plant, when you see a dog or a cat or a bird, we have something in common with them. We have a similar soul, but our soul is just higher and has a rational, intellectual aspect to it. Whether in man there is another form besides the intellectual soul, Thomas says the intellectual soul is united to the body as its substantial form. It is impossible for another substantial form besides the intellectual soul to be found in man. And he says, we must conclude that there is no other substantial form in man besides the intellectual soul, and that the soul, as is virtually contained the sensitive and nutritive souls, so does it virtually contain all inferior forms, and itself alone does whatever the imperfect forms do in other things. The same is to be said of the sensitive soul of brute animals and the nutritive soul in plants, and universally of all more perfect forms with regard to the imperfect. All right, so what is he saying here? There's only one form of the human person, and it's the intellectual soul. There aren't other things as well, right? Number 5, whether the intellectual soul is properly united to a body. Since the form is not for the matter, but rather the matter for the form, we must gather from the form the reason why the matter is such as it is, and not conversely. Now, the intellectual soul, in the order of nature, holds the lowest place among the intellectual substances, inasmuch as it is not naturally gifted with the knowledge of truth, as the angels are. Okay? Remember, the angels, everything was infused. The moment they're created, they know everything they need to know. We're not that way. We're discursive. We go from one thing to the next, but we need a body in order to do it. Okay, that's what he's getting at here. But has to gather knowledge from individual things by way of the senses. As Dionysius says, but nature never fails in necessary things. Therefore, the intellectual soul had to be endowed not only with the power of understanding, but also with the power of feeling. Now, the action of the senses is not performed without a corporeal instrument. Therefore, it behooved the intellectual soul to be united to a body fitted to be a convenient organ of sense. All right, here on earth, our soul needs a body. Okay, in heaven, separated souls, it's going to be different, but we'll get to that eventually. All right, the next two articles I'm going to just very, very quickly summarize because they're a little bit confusing. He says whether the intellectual soul is united to the body through the medium of accidental dispositions, and St. Thomas Aquinas says no. Okay, moving on. Whether the soul is united to the animal body by means of a body. Okay, so is there another body that's, in between the soul and the body? The answer is no to that as well. Article 8, and this is the final article of this question, says whether the soul is in each part of the body. Okay, is the soul in my pinky? Is the soul in my ear? He says, since the soul is united to the body as its form, it must necessarily be in the whole body and in each part thereof. Now, the substantial form perfects not only the whole, but each part of the whole. A proof of which is that on the withdrawal of the soul, no part of the body retains its proper action, right? When we die and the soul goes, nothing happens. Like I said a moment ago, it's a corpse, right? It's enough to say that the whole soul is in each part of the body by totality of perfection and of essence, but not by totality of power, for it is not in each part of the body with regard to each of its powers, but with regard to sight, it is in the eye, and with regard to hearing, it is in the ear, and so forth. All right, so just because the soul is in every part of the body doesn't mean that my hand can talk or my ear can, whatever, smell. Okay, so it has specific functions. All right, I know this has been a long haul, and this is probably one of the longer videos that I've done, but this is important. If we believe that there's a soul, if we believe that, metaphysically, that there is something about us that we can't see and that's animating our bodies, well, we got to understand, what does it mean that is the case? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thanks for joining me, and we've got many, many more questions and articles to talk about in this treatise on man, the treatise on human nature. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us. God bless you.